Imagine, if you will, stepping back in time, not to the grand halls of emperors, nor the sun-drenched villas of the wealthy, but to a different Victorian England, a world hidden in the shadows of progress and prosperity, a world teeming with life, yet simultaneously choked by poverty. Before we can truly understand the hardships faced by those living in Victorian slums, we need to paint a picture of the stark social and economic landscape that made these conditions possible. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Victorian era, named after Queen Victoria's long reign, is often romanticized. We picture grand balls, scientific advancements, and the rise of a powerful empire. And indeed, all of that was true, but that narrative only tells half the story. The other half, a tale of immense inequality, a chasm that yawned between the privileged few and the struggling masses. Think of it like a seesaw, heavily weighted on one side. On one end you have the industrialists, the factory owners, the landed gentry. They're reaping the rewards of the burgeoning industrial revolution, amassing fortunes that would have been unimaginable just a few decades prior. They lived in sprawling estates, staffed by armies of servants, indulging in lavish meals and extravagant leisure activities. Their children attended the finest schools, their futures secure and bright. But on the other end of that seesaw, that's where the vast majority resided. The working class, the backbone of this industrial powerhouse. These were the men, women, and tragically, children who toiled tirelessly in factories, mines, and workshops, often for upwards of 12 to 16 hours a day. They fueled the engines of progress, but they themselves rarely saw the benefits. Wages were meager, barely enough to cover the basic necessities of life, and even those meager wages were precarious, subject to the whims of the market, the availability of work, and the ever-present threat of illness or injury. A single missed day of work could plunge a family into destitution. And what was the safety net? Sadly, it was practically non-existent. There were charitable organizations, of course, and we will discuss those later, but their resources were stretched thin, barely making a dent in the overwhelming need. The government's response? Often slow, inadequate, and driven more by a fear of social unrest than a genuine concern for the welfare of the poor. The workhouse, a dreaded institution offering only the barest sustenance in exchange for back-breaking labor, was often the only alternative to starvation. Imagine the desperation required to willingly enter such a place. This inequality wasn't just about money, though. It permeated every aspect of life. Access to education, healthcare, even basic sanitation were privileges largely reserved for the upper classes. For the poor, life was a constant struggle against disease, hunger, and despair. The very structure of Victorian society reinforced this divide. A rigid class system dictated one's opportunities and limitations. Social mobility was rare. Most people were born into poverty and remained there, trapped in a cycle of hardship that spanned generations. The idea of moving up the social ladder, while romanticized in some novels, was a distant dream for most slum dwellers. Now, you might be wondering, how did this immense inequality come to be? Well, the Industrial Revolution, while bringing unprecedented wealth and technological advancements, also created new forms of poverty and exploitation. The shift from rural agrarian life to urban industrial centers led to mass migration, as people flocked to cities in search of work. But the cities were ill prepared for this influx. Housing was scarce, infrastructure was inadequate, and the existing social services were overwhelmed. Landlords, eager to capitalize on the demand, built cheap, overcrowded tenements, often cramming multiple families into single rooms. These were the breeding grounds of the slums. The rapid pace of industrialization also created a surplus of labor, driving down wages and making workers even more vulnerable to exploitation. The lack of regulations and worker protections allowed factory owners to prioritize profits over the well-being of their employees. Accidents were common, and injuries often went untreated, leaving families without a breadwinner and even further into poverty. So as we delve deeper into the lives of those who inhabited the Victorian slums, remember this backdrop of profound inequality. Remember the vast gulf between the haves and the have-nots, the relentless pressures of industrialization, and the lack of a safety net for the most vulnerable members of society. It's easy to look at these historical events through a romanticized lens, but to truly understand the reality of life in a Victorian slum, we must confront the harsh truths of poverty, exploitation, and social injustice that shaped this era. Only then can we begin to appreciate the resilience, the struggles, and the indomitable spirit of those who lived and died in the shadows of Victorian England. Only then can we truly see what living in a Victorian slum was really like. Let's ease ourselves into this next chapter, shall we? It's a big one, a foundational one for understanding the grim realities of Victorian slum life. We need to talk about the rise of industrialization and the subsequent, almost overwhelming, wave of urban migration. Picture it, Britain, transforming at an unprecedented pace. For centuries, life for the vast majority of people had been rooted in the countryside. Agricultural work dictated the rhythm of life. Seasons changed, harvests came and went, and generations tilled the same soil. But then, everything started to shift. Little by little, then all at once. The Industrial Revolution, that relentless engine of progress, began to reshape the landscape, both literally and figuratively. New technologies, like the steam engine and the power loom, revolutionized production. Factories sprung up, initially near rivers for power, and later concentrated in urban centers where resources were plentiful. These factories offered something new, a promise of regular wages. This was often a deceptive promise, mind you, but it was enough to lure people away from the uncertainties of agricultural life. Farming was, and still is, vulnerable to weather, disease, and fluctuating market prices. A steady wage, however meager, seemed like a beacon of stability in comparison. So people began to move, not just a few but entire families, packing their meager belongings and heading towards the smoky horizons of towns and cities like London, Manchester, Liverpool, and Glasgow. These cities became magnets, drawing in rural populations from all corners of the British Isles and even further afield, particularly Ireland. The promise of work, however difficult, was a powerful draw. Now imagine the impact this had. These cities, originally designed for a much smaller population, were suddenly inundated with newcomers. The existing infrastructure simply couldn't cope. Housing was inadequate, sanitation was non-existent in many areas, and public services were stretched to their absolute breaking point. Think about it. You're used to a certain level of space, perhaps a small cottage or a shared farmhouse. You're used to the rhythms of nature, even if life is hard. Then suddenly, you're crammed into a tiny room, maybe with several other families. Sunlight is scarce, fresh air is even scarcer, and the sounds of the city, the clatter of machinery, the shouts of vendors, the endless foot traffic, assault your senses day and night. This mass migration created a perfect storm. The demand for housing skyrocketed, driving up rents to extortionate levels. Landlords, eager to capitalize on the influx of people, crammed as many tenants as possible into existing buildings, often subdividing already small houses into even smaller, more squalid apartments. These became known as tenements, and they were often breeding grounds for disease and despair. And because so many people were desperate for work, employers could keep wages brutally low. This created a cycle of poverty. People were working long hours in dangerous conditions for barely enough to survive, let alone afford decent housing. It was a system that trapped people, often for generations. Let's also consider the social upheaval. In rural communities, there was often a sense of shared experience, a network of support, however informal. But in the rapidly expanding cities, this sense of community was often lost. People were anonymous, isolated, and vulnerable. The old ways of life were gone, and new social structures hadn't yet formed to take their place. The result? Overcrowding, disease, poverty, and social breakdown. And it all stemmed from this massive influx of people into cities that were simply unprepared to receive them. The infrastructure buckled under the pressure, the social fabric frayed, and the seeds of the Victorian slums were firmly sown. It's important to understand that this wasn't simply an accident. It was a consequence of unchecked industrial growth and a lack of planning. The focus was on production, on profit, on progress, without much consideration for the human cost. The needs of the working class were largely ignored, and the consequences were devastating. So as we move forward, remember this context. Remember the sheer scale of the urban migration, the pressure it placed on cities, and the resulting chaos and misery. It's a vital piece of the puzzle when we try to understand what living in a Victorian slum was really like. Without this foundation, the picture simply isn't complete. Now let's delve a little deeper into those maps and those neighborhoods. All right, let's settle in and really try to picture the landscape we're talking about. Forget the postcard images of Victorian London for a moment. We're diving deep into the heart of the slums, and the very first thing you'd notice, even before you see anything clearly, would be the smell. Imagine a concoction of rotting food, human waste, animal dung, coal smoke, and stagnant water, all simmering under a perpetually grey sky. It's a pungent, overpowering aroma that clings to everything and everyone, and it's a constant reminder of the squalor. But the smell is just the beginning. Let's try to map these neighborhoods out in our minds, because mapping at the time was a very haphazard process, often incomplete or entirely inaccurate. These areas just sprang up organically, haphazardly, almost like fungi, in the cracks and forgotten corners of the rapidly growing cities. Think of it less like organized streets and more like a tangled web. The core of the slums often grew out of pre-existing buildings, maybe old workshops or abandoned factories. As the population swelled, every inch of available space was crammed with makeshift housing. What started as a single-family home might become divided into multiple dwellings, with rooms subdivided again and again until they barely qualify as living spaces. Then, as need grew, courts and alleys would be built in any space not already occupied. Buildings crammed together with little rhyme or reason. Passages barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. These weren't designed, they just happened. Think of them as urban canyons, perpetually shrouded in shadow, regardless of the time of day, and the materials. Well, they were anything but quality. Often the buildings were constructed from the cheapest, most readily available materials. We're talking about crumbling brick, rotting wood, and patched-up roofing. Anything that could be used was used. Think of it as a patchwork quilt, except instead of being warm and comforting, it was cold, damp, and structurally unsound. Now, imagine that it has rained. In fact, imagine it has rained constantly for days. The unpaved streets become quagmires of mud and filth, making it nearly impossible to navigate without sinking ankle-deep in muck. This water seeps into everything. It saturates the walls of the buildings, creating damp and mold, which in turn exacerbates respiratory problems. It carries disease. It's everywhere. And the air quality? Terrible. Factories belching out black smoke day and night, further darkening the already gloomy environment. The air hangs heavy with soot and particulate matter, making it difficult to breathe, especially for those suffering from lung conditions. Imagine living in a perpetual fog of pollution, where the sun is a distant memory. These areas were desperately overcrowded. Buildings designed for a single family might house dozens, crammed into tiny, airless rooms. Privacy was a luxury, and personal space was non-existent. You would be constantly surrounded by people, sharing the same cramped quarters, the same inadequate sanitation, and the same limited resources. Tempers were short, tensions were high, and disease spread like wildfire. Look around and you'll see that open space is almost non-existent. No parks, no gardens, no green spaces to offer respite from the grim reality. Only a few poorly maintained squares, used as dumping grounds or impromptu marketplaces. Furthermore, you'd probably also notice the incredible lack of infrastructure. There was no proper sewage system. Waste was often dumped directly into the streets, where it flowed into open drains or cesspools. This created a breeding ground for disease and contaminated the water supply. Remember, this is before modern sanitation was well understood or universally implemented. Water was often scarce and of poor quality. Residents might have to queue for hours at communal taps, only to find that the water was contaminated with sewage or industrial waste. Many families relied on polluted wells or rivers for their water supply, further increasing the risk of illness. What about the physical landscape inside the dwellings? Well, imagine bare brick walls, crumbling plaster, and damp floors. Furniture was sparse and often broken. Bedding was inadequate and infested with vermin. There was little or no ventilation, and the air was thick with the smell of stale food, unwashed bodies, and human waste. Light was a precious commodity. Windows were small and often covered with grime, allowing little natural light to penetrate. Many homes were lit by candles or oil lamps, which provided a dim and flickering light and posed a fire hazard. Remember that electricity was still relatively new and mostly unavailable to the poorer population. Even the very ground underfoot was often unstable. Many slum dwellings were built on marshy land or reclaimed industrial sites, making them prone to flooding and subsidence. The ground itself seemed to conspire against the inhabitants, making their lives even more precarious. This environment fostered a constant sense of despair. The relentless squalor, the overcrowding, the lack of sanitation, and the constant threat of disease all contributed to a sense of hopelessness. It was an environment that stifled ambition, crushed spirits, and trapped people in a cycle of poverty. So mapping the slums isn't just about drawing lines on a map. It's about understanding the physical reality of the places where so many people lived and died. It's about recognizing the brutal conditions that shaped their lives and understanding the systemic inequalities that perpetuated their suffering. It's a difficult image, of course, but it's important to see it, to understand it, so we don't forget it. Let's move on now to consider the actual dwellings themselves and their conditions. Let's talk about where these people actually lived. Housing conditions in the Victorian slums were, to put it mildly, absolutely dreadful. We're talking overcrowding on a scale that's almost unimaginable today, buildings crumbling into disrepair, and a complete absence of even the most basic sanitation. It was a recipe for disaster, and one that played out tragically every single day. Imagine families, sometimes 10 or 12 people, crammed into a single room. One room. That's it. This wasn't an exception, it was the norm. Whole families, grandparents, parents, children, all living, sleeping, eating, and dying in that one cramped space. Privacy, forget about it. Personal space, a distant dream. And of course, this level of overcrowding had a devastating impact on hygiene and health, which we'll touch on later. But just picture it, the sheer physical discomfort, the constant noise, the lack of any escape. It's difficult for us to even comprehend the psychological toll that this kind of unrelenting pressure would have taken. Now, add to that the fact that these buildings were often in a state of extreme dilapidation. Many were hastily constructed back-to-backs, cheap housing thrown up as quickly as possible to accommodate the influx of workers flooding into the cities. These houses were notorious for their poor construction quality and lack of ventilation. Walls were thin, often damp, and riddled with cracks. Roofs leaked, letting in rain and dampness, which, surprise, surprise, only exacerbated the existing problems with mold and mildew. The foundations were often unstable, meaning the buildings were constantly shifting and settling, leading to further cracks and structural weaknesses. It wasn't uncommon for entire sections of these buildings to simply collapse. I mean, imagine going to sleep at night wondering if the roof might cave in on top of you. That was a very real fear for many living in these slums. And then there's the issue of sanitation, or rather the lack of it. Remember, we're talking about a time before widespread plumbing, before modern sewage systems. Waste disposal was a massive problem. There were often communal privies, maybe one or two for an entire street, overflowing, unsanitary and breeding grounds for disease. Human waste, animal waste, rotting food, all mixed together in a stinking, festering mess. And often this waste would simply drain into the streets, mixing with the rainwater and creating a putrid, flowing river of filth. Can you imagine the smell? A constant, overpowering stench that permeated everything. It clung to your clothes, your hair, your skin. You couldn't escape it. Many houses didn't even have access to these inadequate communal privies. Instead, residents might have to rely on chamber pots, which they would then empty into the streets or into nearby rivers or streams, which of course contaminated the water supply. So not only were people living in squalor, they were literally surrounded by their own excrement. It was a public health nightmare waiting to happen. And it did happen, repeatedly. The streets themselves were often unpaved and littered with debris. Piles of garbage accumulated in the gutters, attracting rats and other vermin. These rats weren't just unpleasant, they were carriers of disease, and in the cramped, overcrowded conditions of the slums, disease spread like wildfire. Imagine the diseases thriving in these conditions. We're talking about cholera, typhoid, dysentery, all waterborne illnesses that thrived in the contaminated water and unsanitary conditions. Tuberculosis, or consumption as it was often called, was also rampant, spreading through the air in the close confines of the overcrowded houses. Think about the children growing up in these environments, playing in the streets amidst the filth, breathing in the polluted air, exposed to disease at every turn. Their immune systems were constantly under attack, their bodies weakened by malnutrition and lack of hygiene. It's no wonder that infant mortality rates were so incredibly high. It's truly heartbreaking to consider the lives that were lost, the potential that was never realized, all because of these utterly appalling living conditions. And it wasn't just the physical environment that was so damaging. The slums were also places of social and moral decay. The desperation and poverty led to crime, violence, and despair. Families were torn apart by hardship, and individuals were often forced to resort to desperate measures to survive. It was a vicious cycle, with poverty breeding poverty, and squalor perpetuating squalor. Now, it's easy to look back on this era and judge, to wonder why something wasn't done sooner to alleviate the suffering of these people. But it's important to remember that Victorian society was very different from our own. There was a widespread belief that poverty was a result of individual failings, rather than a consequence of systemic inequality. And there was a real reluctance to interfere with the free market, even when it was clear that it was causing immense suffering. It took decades of campaigning by social reformers, philanthropists, and journalists to finally bring about meaningful change that came far too late for so many. The housing conditions in the Victorian slums were a scandal, a stain on the conscience of a nation that prided itself on its progress and prosperity. They were a testament to the dark side of industrialization, the human cost of unchecked economic growth, and they serve as a stark reminder of the importance of ensuring that everyone, regardless of their background, has access to safe, sanitary, and decent housing. Because without that basic foundation, it's impossible to build a healthy, thriving society. The story of Victorian slums is, in many ways, a story of water, or rather the lack of clean water, and the terrifying abundance of, well, everything else. Imagine, if you will, a world without reliable plumbing, without sewage systems as we understand them, a world where the simple act of drinking water could be a gamble with your life. For the inhabitants of these overcrowded districts, access to fresh water was a constant struggle. While the wealthier parts of Victorian cities began to enjoy the benefits of piped water, the slums were often left to rely on a patchwork of inadequate and frequently contaminated sources. Water companies, often private enterprises, were slow to extend their networks to the poorest areas, deeming it unprofitable. So what options were left? Many relied on public standpipes or communal taps, often only turned on for a few hours a day, if that. Imagine the chaos, the pushing and shoving, the sheer desperation to fill buckets and containers before the precious supply was cut off once more. These communal sources were breeding grounds for disease, frequently located near open sewers or overflowing cesspools. Contamination was rampant. Think about people using the same bucket, dunking it into the same shared source, potentially spreading illness with every dip. And even if the water initially started out relatively clean, drawn perhaps from a river some distance away, the journey to the slums, through leaky pipes and dirty containers, often rendered it unsafe to drink. Lead pipes, a common feature of the time, leached toxins into the water, causing a range of health problems, from stomach cramps to neurological damage. Then there was the issue of cost. Even if a water company did supply the slum, the charges were often prohibitive for the very poorest families. Many were forced to buy water from vendors who would purchase it wholesale and then resell it at a profit. This water was often of questionable quality, and the inflated prices further drained the meager resources of those already struggling to survive. But the lack of clean water was only half the battle. The other, perhaps even more pressing, challenge was the disposal of waste. Human waste, animal waste, industrial waste, all flowing together in a revolting, disease-ridden torrent. In the absence of proper sewage systems, the slums relied on a combination of cesspools, privies, basically outdoor toilets, and open drains. Cesspools, often located directly beneath houses, were meant to collect human waste, but they were frequently poorly constructed, leaking into the surrounding soil and contaminating groundwater. Imagine living above a constantly overflowing pit of, well, you get the picture. The smell alone must have been unbearable. Privies, shared by multiple families, were often overflowing and rarely cleaned. The waste would then be collected, or more accurately, not collected, by night soil men, who would cart it away to be dumped elsewhere. But the sheer volume of waste, combined with the lack of effective collection services, meant that much of it simply remained in the streets, festering in the sun and rain. And then there were the open drains. These were little more than ditches running along the sides of the streets, designed to carry away rainwater and everything else: animal carcasses, rotting food, industrial effluent, human excrement, all mingled together in a nauseating stew. These drains were a breeding ground for flies, rats, and a host of other vermin, further spreading disease and exacerbating the already appalling conditions. During periods of heavy rain, these drains would often overflow, flooding the streets and even seeping into homes. Imagine wading through knee-deep sewage just to get to your front door. Imagine the health risks, the constant exposure to bacteria and parasites. The combination of contaminated water and inadequate waste disposal created a perfect storm for the spread of disease. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and other waterborne illnesses were rampant in the slums, claiming the lives of countless men, women, and children. These weren't just abstract statistics. These were real people, families torn apart by preventable diseases. Cholera, in particular, was a recurring nightmare. This terrifying disease, characterized by severe diarrhea and vomiting, could kill within hours. Outbreaks swept through the slums with devastating speed, overwhelming the already strained medical services. The link between cholera and contaminated water was initially poorly understood, leading to misguided attempts to control the outbreaks. It wasn't until the work of Dr. John Snow, who famously mapped the cases of cholera in London during the 1854 outbreak and traced the source to a contaminated water pump, that the importance of clean water was fully recognized. Typhoid, another deadly waterborne disease, was also a constant threat. Spread through contaminated food and water, typhoid caused fever, headache, and abdominal pain, and could lead to serious complications, including death. And even those who survived these illnesses were often left with long-term health problems, further weakening their already precarious hold on life. The conditions in the Victorian slums were, quite simply, a public health disaster. The lack of clean water and the inadequate waste disposal systems created an environment where disease thrived, claiming the lives of the most vulnerable members of society. It's a grim reminder of the importance of sanitation and the devastating consequences of neglecting the basic needs of the poor. It serves as a cautionary tale, urging us to never take clean water and proper sanitation for granted. Alright, let's settle in and talk about something pretty fundamental to life. Food. But not the kind of food we enjoy now, with its abundance and variety. We're talking about the Victorian slums, where food often meant simply survival. Imagine for a moment what it must have been like to constantly feel hungry. Not just a little peckish, but that deep, gnawing emptiness that saps your energy, clouds your mind, and makes even the simplest tasks feel like climbing a mountain. That was the daily reality for so many living in the Victorian slums. Access to food was a constant struggle, a never-ending battle against poverty. The sheer lack of money meant that families had to make impossible choices. Do they pay the rent, even if it means going hungry for days? Or do they buy a little food, knowing that they might be evicted? There was rarely a good answer, and even when they could afford something, the quality was, well, let's just say it was far from ideal. Forget about fresh produce bursting with vitamins. Forget about lean meats and whole grains. What was available to the slum dwellers was often the cheapest, most heavily processed, and frankly sometimes downright rotten food imaginable. Bread was a staple, of course, but even that wasn't guaranteed. It was often adulterated, meaning it was mixed with things like chalk, plaster, or even sawdust to bulk it up and make it seem like you were getting more for your money. The millers and bakers weren't exactly known for their ethical standards when it came to serving the poor. This meant that even something as basic as bread could be doing more harm than good. Meat was a rare treat. When it was available, it was usually the cheapest cuts, often riddled with fat and gristle, and sometimes already starting to go bad. You might find offal, things like liver, kidneys, and hearts, on sale at a lower price, but even those required careful preparation to make them palatable and safe to eat. Food poisoning was a constant threat. Vegetables were equally scarce and of poor quality. Root vegetables like potatoes and turnips were common, but even those could be difficult to obtain and prepare. Leafy greens were a luxury, and fresh fruits were practically unheard of. This lack of vitamins and minerals led to widespread deficiencies and a host of health problems. Think about scurvy, for instance. This disease, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was rampant in the slums. Imagine your gums bleeding, your teeth loosening, and your joints aching, all from a lack of something as simple as an orange. Then there was the issue of contaminated food. The slums were filthy places, with overflowing sewers and open drains running through the streets. Food was often sold in unsanitary conditions, exposed to flies and rodents. Milk in particular was a major source of disease. It was often watered down and contaminated with bacteria, leading to outbreaks of illnesses like typhoid and cholera. Even something as seemingly harmless as tea could be problematic. Sugar, a luxury item, was often adulterated with sand or other impurities, and the tea itself might be old, stale, or even mixed with used tea leaves that had been re-dried and sold again. So what did a typical meal look like for a slum dweller? Perhaps a piece of stale, adulterated bread with a thin scraping of margarine. Maybe a watery soup made with leftover vegetable scraps and a bit of bone for flavor. Or, if they were lucky, a small piece of fatty meat that had been cooked for hours to make it tender enough to eat. The lack of proper nutrition had a devastating impact on the health and well-being of the slum dwellers. Children were particularly vulnerable. Malnutrition stunted their growth, weakened their immune systems, and made them more susceptible to disease. Many children died before their 5th birthday, simply because they didn't get enough to eat. Adults suffered too. They were constantly tired and weak, making it difficult to work and earn a living. They were more likely to get sick, and they were less able to recover from illness. The constant stress of hunger and poverty also took a toll on their mental health. And let's not forget the impact on pregnant women. Malnutrition during pregnancy could lead to serious complications, including premature birth, low birth weight, and even stillbirth. The cycle of poverty and ill health was perpetuated from one generation to the next. It's heartbreaking to think about, isn't it? That such a basic human need, the need for food, was so often denied to so many. It paints a stark picture of the inequalities of Victorian society and the desperate conditions in which so many people were forced to live. It really does give you a new appreciation for the food that we have available to us today, and a deeper understanding of the struggles faced by those who came before us. Child labor, exploitation in factories, mines, and on the streets. Imagine, if you will, a world where childhood innocence is a luxury, a privilege reserved for the fortunate few. In the Victorian slums, that's precisely what it was. For countless children, their early years weren't filled with laughter and play, but with back-breaking labor, dangerous conditions, and a relentless struggle for survival. It's a difficult, perhaps even uncomfortable, reality to confront, but it's a crucial piece of understanding the full picture of Victorian slum life. The Industrial Revolution, while bringing about unprecedented progress, also cast a long shadow, and that shadow often fell directly upon the shoulders of children. As factories sprung up like mushrooms after a rain, fueled by steam power and an insatiable demand for goods, the need for cheap labor grew exponentially. And who was cheaper, more easily controlled, and less likely to protest than a child? In the textile mills, children as young as 5 or 6 years old were employed as scavengers and piecers. Their small, nimble fingers were perfectly suited for reaching into the intricate machinery to repair broken threads or collect scraps of cotton waste. The work was monotonous, exhausting, and incredibly dangerous. Imagine spending 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, surrounded by deafening noise, breathing in air thick with cotton dust, and constantly risking life and limb in the relentless rhythm of the machines. Accidents were commonplace, and the consequences were often horrific: crushed fingers, lost limbs, even death. There were no safety regulations, no workers' compensation, and little concern for the well-being of these tiny workers. They were simply cogs in the machine, easily replaced if broken. But the factories weren't the only places where children toiled. Deep beneath the earth, in the dark and suffocating confines of the coal mines, other children worked as trappers and hurriers. Trappers, often no older than 5, sat alone in the pitch black, opening and closing ventilation doors to regulate airflow. Can you imagine the isolation, the fear, the sheer boredom of spending entire days in complete darkness, waiting for the next coal cart to pass? Hurriers, slightly older, were tasked with hauling heavy loads of coal through narrow tunnels, often on their hands and knees. They pulled carts weighing hundreds of pounds, sometimes with straps digging into their bare skin. The conditions were brutal: low ceilings, cramped spaces, and the ever-present threat of collapse or explosion. The air was thick with coal dust, leading to respiratory problems and a shortened lifespan. Again, safety was non-existent, and injuries were frequent. And it wasn't just the factories and mines that claimed these children's lives. Many were forced to work on the streets, scavenging for scraps, selling matches or flowers, or simply begging for food. These children, often orphans or runaways, were particularly vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. They faced the constant dangers of traffic, disease, and violence. They were exposed to the harsh realities of the streets at a young age, forced to grow up far too quickly. Consider the plight of the chimney sweeps. Young boys, often as young as 4, were forced to climb inside narrow, soot-filled chimneys to clean them. The work was incredibly dangerous, and the boys were often subjected to burns, cuts, and respiratory problems. The constant exposure to soot could lead to cancer, and many chimney sweeps died young. The practice was eventually outlawed, but not before countless children suffered and died. The reasons for child labor were complex, rooted in poverty, desperation, and a lack of social safety nets. Families struggling to survive often had no choice but to send their children to work, contributing whatever meager wages they could earn to the family income. there were few alternatives. Schools were often expensive and inaccessible, and even if they were available, many families couldn't afford to lose the income that their children brought in. The exploitation of child labor wasn't just a moral failing, it was also a short-sighted economic policy. It robbed children of their childhood, their education, and their future. It condemned them to a life of poverty and hardship, perpetuating the cycle of deprivation from one generation to the next. It's easy to look back at this period in history and condemn the practices that allowed child labor to flourish, but it's important to remember that these were complex times, driven by powerful economic forces and deeply ingrained social attitudes. It took decades of activism, reform, and legislation to finally put an end to the worst forms of child labor. As we reflect on the plight of these children, let us remember their struggles, their sacrifices, and their resilience. Let us be grateful for the progress that has been made in protecting children and ensuring their right to a safe and healthy childhood. And let us remain vigilant in our efforts to combat child labor wherever it exists in the world today. Because the fight for children's rights is a fight that must never end. It's a sobering thought, I know, but one that must be considered as we continue our journey into the heart of Victorian slum life. It is by remembering the darkness that we can truly appreciate the light. And now, take a deep breath. We'll continue our story soon. For the women of the Victorian slums, work wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. Survival depended on it, but the options available were often bleak, offering little in the way of security, respect, or even a living wage. We're going to explore 3 common paths: domestic service, factory labor, and for some, the devastating reality of prostitution. Let's begin with domestic service. This was by far the most widespread form of employment for women in Victorian England, and particularly for those from impoverished backgrounds. It was almost seen as a rite of passage, a way to escape the squalor of the slums, at least temporarily. Imagine a young girl, barely into her teens, perhaps as young as 10 or 11, leaving her family behind to work as a maid in a wealthier household. The allure was simple: a roof over her head, regular meals, and a meager wage. But the reality was far from idyllic. These young women were often on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Their duties were endless: cleaning, cooking, laundry, child-minding, running errands, and everything in between. Privacy was non-existent, and the hours were grueling. They slept in cramped attics or damp basements, often sharing a room with other servants. Wages were pitiful, barely enough to send a small amount back home to their families. Abuse, both verbal and physical, was unfortunately common. They were often at the mercy of their employers, with little recourse if mistreated. Pregnancy outside of marriage was a disaster, often resulting in dismissal and utter destitution, leaving them vulnerable and alone. Despite these hardships, domestic service was seen as a respectable option, providing a degree of stability compared to other forms of labor. It offered a safe haven of sorts, however fraught it may be. Now, let's move on to factory labor. The Industrial Revolution brought with it a demand for cheap labor, and women, along with children, were seen as ideal candidates. Factories, particularly textile mills, were filled with women operating dangerous machinery for long hours and very little pay. Think of the deafening noise, the oppressive heat, and the ever-present threat of injury. Accidents were common, and the lack of safety regulations meant that serious injuries, even death, were frequent occurrences. The work was monotonous and physically demanding, involving repetitive movements that took a heavy toll on the body. Women often worked 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, in cramped, poorly ventilated factories. The air was thick with dust and lint, leading to respiratory problems and other health issues. The wages were so low that women struggled to feed themselves and their families, often forced to supplement their income through other means. Factory work also had a devastating impact on family life. Mothers were often separated from their children for long periods, leaving them in the care of older siblings or relatives. The stress and exhaustion of factory work took a toll on their physical and mental health. making it difficult to care for their families. While factory work offered a slightly higher wage than domestic service in some instances, the risks and hardships were immense. It was a brutal existence, stripping women of their dignity and health in the pursuit of profit. Finally, let's confront the difficult and heartbreaking reality of prostitution. For some women in the Victorian slums, there were simply no other options. Driven by desperation, poverty, and often abandonment, they turned to prostitution as a means of survival. It was a dangerous and degrading path, fraught with peril. Prostitution was rampant in the slums, with women soliciting customers in the streets, pubs, and lodging houses. They were vulnerable to violence, exploitation, and disease. Many were forced into prostitution by pimps or family members, trapped in a cycle of abuse and dependence. The risks were immense, including sexually transmitted diseases, unwanted pregnancies, and arrest. The social stigma associated with prostitution was crushing. These women were ostracized by society, condemned as immoral and depraved. They were often denied access to healthcare and other forms of support, further isolating them and trapping them in their circumstances. While some women managed to escape prostitution, many were trapped in a cycle of poverty and despair, their lives tragically cut short by disease, violence, or suicide. It's a heartbreaking reminder of the desperate measures women were forced to take to survive in the harsh realities of the Victorian slums. Each of these work options, domestic service, factory labor, and prostitution, paints a stark picture of the limited choices available to women in the Victorian slums. They were trapped in a system that offered them little opportunity for advancement or escape. Their labor was exploited, their bodies were often abused, and their dignity was frequently stripped away. Yet, despite these immense challenges, they persevered, displaying incredible resilience and strength in the face of unimaginable hardship. Their stories are a testament to the human spirit and a reminder of the injustices that persisted in Victorian society. Imagine, if you will, trying to climb a greased pole. Every step forward seems to slip back too. That, in essence, was the plight of so many living in Victorian England's slums. A constant, exhausting battle against the relentless pull of poverty and the crushing weight of debt. It wasn't merely a lack of money. It was a whole system, a vicious cycle almost impossible to break. For a start, wages were abysmal. Often they were barely enough to cover the rent for a single room. And remember, that single room might house an entire family. Think about it, paying for a damp, cramped space before you've even bought a single crumb of bread. And employment itself was precarious. A cough that wouldn't shift, a twisted ankle, a downturn in the local trade, any of these could mean instant unemployment. No sick pay, no safety net, just the gnawing anxiety of wondering where the next meal would come from. Now, let's say you do manage to find some work. The workhouse looms, that dreaded place of last resort where families are separated and dignity is stripped bare. You do almost anything to avoid ending up there, and so you turn to credit. The local shopkeeper might extend a line of credit, allowing you to buy food and necessities on tick. Sounds helpful, right? But the interest rates were exorbitant. They knew you were desperate, and they exploited that. Every penny borrowed became a heavier burden, trapping you deeper in debt. You start owing money to the shopkeeper, or even other people. These debts would quickly spiral out of control. Imagine struggling to buy food and then facing extra costs on top of it. Then imagine your employer decides to lower wages. Then your child gets sick. Then you need to choose between buying medicine or paying the rent. This is where the pawnbroker comes in, a fixture in every slum neighborhood. These businesses were absolutely everywhere, recognizable by their 3 golden balls hanging above the door. Desperate families would trudge through those doors, clutching whatever small possessions they had left. A wedding ring, a Sunday suit, a clock, tools, a blanket, anything that might fetch a few shillings. They would literally bet their own possessions on the fact that they could get themselves out of poverty, so they could then return and buy their possessions back. They were, in many ways, gambling with their own lives. The pawnbroker would assess the item, offering a loan, usually a fraction of its true value. The interest rates were again sky high. and the terms were often brutal. Miss a payment, and your item was gone, sold off to someone else. Think of the emotional cost of that. Losing a family heirloom, a reminder of happier times, all because you couldn't scrape together a few pennies. And who used pawnbrokers? It wasn't always the stereotypical lazy drunkard, though that stereotype certainly existed. It was often hard-working families, struggling to make ends meet. A widow trying to feed her children, a factory worker laid off due to illness. The pawnbroker was their last resort, a lifeline that often ended up strangling them. This system created a cycle that was incredibly difficult to escape. You pawn your belongings to pay for food, but the interest on the pawn ticket eats into your already meager income. Eventually, you have to pawn something else to pay the interest on the first item, and so on. You're constantly chasing your tail, sinking deeper and deeper into debt. The consequences were devastating. Malnutrition weakened the body, making people more susceptible to disease. Stress and anxiety took their toll on mental health. Families were torn apart by the strain of constant financial pressure, and children, witnessing their parents' desperation, were often drawn into a life of poverty themselves. The pawnbroker, in a way, became a symbol of this relentless cycle, a constant reminder of the precariousness of life and the lengths to which people would go to survive. It wasn't necessarily that pawnbrokers were evil people, but they were part of a system that profited from the misery of others. They were a symptom of a much larger problem, the deep systemic inequality that plagued Victorian England, a system where those with wealth thrived, while those without were trapped in a seemingly endless spiral of poverty and debt. And it's that spiral that, when you look back, is truly one of the most haunting and desperate aspects of life in the Victorian slums. A spiral with an almost inescapable gravitational pull. And now, let's talk about something. Well, it's not exactly pleasant, but it's absolutely vital to understanding life in the Victorian slums: disease. You see, the conditions we've described, the overcrowding, the lack of clean water, the mountains of refuse, they weren't just unpleasant. They were a breeding ground for some truly terrifying illnesses. Imagine living in a room with 10 other people, where human waste is overflowing in the street outside, and the only source of water is a communal pump that's likely contaminated. It's not hard to see how disease could spread like wildfire, is it? And that's precisely what happened. 3 diseases, in particular, haunted the Victorian slums: cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis. These weren't just abstract threats, they were ever-present realities, snatching away loved ones and casting a long shadow of fear over every household. Let's start with cholera. This one was a real killer, literally. Cholera is caused by bacteria in contaminated water, and it leads to severe diarrhea and vomiting. Now imagine experiencing that in a cramped, unsanitary room with no access to proper medical care. The rapid dehydration could kill you in a matter of days, sometimes even hours. Outbreaks of cholera were terrifying events. They swept through the slums like a scythe, leaving devastation in their wake. The symptoms were so dramatic and so swift that they caused widespread panic. People would desperately try to flee infected areas, but of course, often they carried the disease with them, only to begin a new wave of suffering somewhere else. The Great Stink of 1858, when the River Thames became so polluted that Parliament had to suspend its sittings, vividly illustrates the scale of the problem. The smell was so bad, it forced action, but for many living in the slums, they were surrounded by a great stink every single day of their lives. It's hard to even fathom. Then there was typhoid. Typhoid, like cholera, is also spread through contaminated food and water. While its symptoms weren't quite as dramatic as cholera, it was still a very serious illness. It caused high fever, abdominal pain, and a general feeling of weakness and malaise. Typhoid could linger for weeks, even months, leaving its victims debilitated and vulnerable to other infections. Many wouldn't ever fully recover. They'd just be left weaker, more susceptible, another shadow flitting through the smog. Again, imagine trying to recover from such a debilitating illness when you're already malnourished and living in squalor. It's a truly grim thought, isn't it? And finally, perhaps the most insidious of all, there was tuberculosis, or TB, often referred to as consumption back then. TB is a bacterial infection that primarily affects the lungs, though it can spread to other parts of the body as well. It's spread through the air when an infected person coughs or sneezes, and in overcrowded, poorly ventilated slums, it was practically impossible to avoid. TB was a slow killer. It would slowly waste away its victims, causing persistent cough, fever, night sweats, and weight loss. It was particularly cruel because it often affected young adults, robbing them of their future. There's something particularly tragic about that, I think, when someone's life is just beginning and it's brutally cut short. It seemed like TB was just always present, a constant threat lurking in the shadows of every dark alley and crowded room. Because it spread through the air, there was no escape. It was just a matter of time before it would find you. Now, what made these diseases so prevalent in the slums? Well, it wasn't just the lack of sanitation. It was a perfect storm of factors. Poor nutrition weakened people's immune systems, making them more susceptible to infection. Overcrowding facilitated the rapid spread of disease. And the lack of access to medical care meant that people were often left to suffer without any treatment at all. And it wasn't just adults who suffered. Children were particularly vulnerable to these diseases. Their immune systems weren't fully developed, and they were often exposed to contaminated food and water. The mortality rate among children in the slums was absolutely shocking, but we'll delve into that in more detail later. The constant threat of disease had a profound impact on the lives of slum dwellers. It created a climate of fear and anxiety. People were constantly worried about getting sick or about losing loved ones to illness. It also fostered a sense of fatalism. Many people felt that there was nothing they could do to protect themselves, that disease was simply an inevitable part of life. And in many ways, they were right. Without clean water, proper sanitation, and access to medical care, they were trapped in a cycle of disease and death. The tragic reality is that these outbreaks were not just random events, they were a direct consequence of poverty and inequality. They were a stark reminder of the human cost of industrialization and urbanization. It's hard to imagine, in our modern world with all of our medical advancements and public health initiatives, how utterly helpless people were against these diseases. But it's important to remember, to truly understand the experiences of those who lived in the Victorian slums. It was a world where disease was a constant companion, a silent stalker, always waiting to pounce. And it claimed far too many lives, far too soon. The Victorian era, often romanticized with images of grand estates and technological marvels, held a far grimmer reality for those trapped within its sprawling slums. And perhaps no statistic paints a starker picture of this suffering than the devastatingly high rate of infant mortality. We're not talking about a slight increase in childhood deaths. We're talking about a tragedy unfolding on an unimaginable scale, one that fundamentally shaped the lives, and all too often, the deaths, of the poorest families. Imagine this: you're a young mother, maybe barely out of your teens yourself. You live in a single cramped room, shared with your husband, perhaps your parents, and several other siblings. The air is thick with coal smoke, dampness clings to the walls, and the ever-present smell of refuse permeates everything. Your diet consists mainly of bread, potatoes, and perhaps a bit of tainted meat if you're lucky. Clean water is a luxury, and the water you do have is often contaminated with sewage and disease. Now you're pregnant. The odds are stacked against both you and your child from the very beginning. Malnutrition weakens your body, making pregnancy incredibly dangerous. The lack of prenatal care means that complications that could be easily addressed today become life-threatening. Even simple things like rest and proper nutrition are unattainable in the crushing circumstances of slum life. and then the baby arrives. Instead of a joyous celebration, it's often a moment overshadowed by fear. Fear of the future, yes, but also the very real fear that your child simply won't survive. Infant mortality rates in Victorian slums were shockingly high. In some areas, more than half of all children died before their 5th birthday. That's right, half. Imagine the unimaginable grief of burying child after child, a constant recurring nightmare for so many families. So, what exactly caused these staggering death rates? Well, the causes were multifaceted and interconnected, a vicious web of poverty, disease, and neglect. Let's start with disease. The overcrowded and unsanitary conditions of the slums were a breeding ground for infectious illnesses. Diseases like measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, and diarrhea ran rampant, easily spreading through the close quarters of tenement buildings. These illnesses, which we now consider relatively minor with proper medical care, were often fatal to children whose immune systems were already weakened by malnutrition and poor living conditions. Then there was the ever-present threat of waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid. The water supply in the slums was often contaminated with sewage, making it a deadly cocktail for infants and young children. Imagine constantly battling a stomach ailment, the dehydration, the fever, the sheer exhaustion. It's a brutal reality that many children faced every single day of their short lives. Poor nutrition played a devastating role as well. Breastfeeding, while common, wasn't always sufficient, especially for mothers who were themselves malnourished. And when babies were weaned, they were often given inadequate or contaminated food. Cow's milk, for example, was often diluted with water to stretch it further, robbing it of essential nutrients. Sometimes mothers unknowingly fed their babies contaminated or spoiled foods, simply because that was all they could afford. Accidents were also a significant contributor to infant mortality. Overcrowded homes meant that babies were often left unattended or slept in unsafe conditions. Falls, burns from open fires, and accidental suffocation were all tragically common occurrences. There was no such thing as baby-proofing a slum dwelling. Every corner held potential danger. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this high mortality rate was the sheer inevitability of it all. People living in the slums were trapped in a cycle of poverty, disease, and death. They lacked access to basic health care, education, and opportunities to improve their lives. They were essentially fighting a losing battle against a system that seemed designed to keep them down. The sheer scale of infant mortality also had a profound impact on the families themselves. The constant fear of losing a child, the grief of repeated bereavements, and the psychological toll of living in such dire circumstances, it's almost impossible for us to truly grasp the depth of their suffering. It created a pervasive sense of hopelessness and despair that permeated every aspect of their lives. It's easy to look back at these statistics and feel detached, to see them as just numbers on a page. But behind each number was a real child, a real family, a real tragedy. To truly understand the reality of life in a Victorian slum, we must confront the heartbreaking truth of infant mortality and acknowledge the immense suffering endured by those who were forced to live and die in these conditions. And perhaps by understanding the past, we can work to prevent such tragedies from happening again, ensuring that every child has the opportunity to live a healthy and fulfilling life, free from the grip of poverty and disease. Because every number has a name, a face, and a story, and those stories deserve to be remembered. Of course, delving into the lives of those residing in Victorian slums invariably leads us to a darker, more unsettling aspect: crime and violence. It wasn't just poverty that haunted these areas. It was also the ever-present spectre of lawlessness driven by desperation and despair. Petty theft was perhaps the most common offense. Imagine a family struggling to feed themselves. Maybe their father is out of work, sick, or maybe even just lost to the drink. A loaf of bread or a piece of coal, stolen from a market stall or a nearby warehouse, could mean the difference between a meager meal and going to bed hungry. These weren't acts of malice, so much as acts of survival. Children, small and nimble, were often forced into this grim work, their tiny hands slipping into pockets or snatching unattended goods. They were easy to miss and harder to catch. For some, it was simply the norm. Their family did it, their friends did it, so they did it too. It's easy to judge, but what choice did they have? Then there were the pawnbrokers. While technically legal, they thrived on the desperation of the poor, offering loans at exorbitant interest rates, secured against what little possessions a family had. These could be anything from tools, to clothes, to precious mementos. When the inevitable happened, when the family couldn't repay the loan, the pawnbroker would seize the goods, leaving them even more destitute and vulnerable. The cycle of debt and poverty deepened. It was the perfect legal scam, sanctioned by the very society that looked down on them. Beyond petty theft, more organized crime began to flourish in the slum environment. Gangs, often composed of young men and older seasoned criminals, carved out territories and controlled them through intimidation and violence. These weren't the sophisticated criminal organizations we might imagine today, but more loosely affiliated groups, driven by a desire for power, respect, and of course money. They ran protection rackets, extorting money from local businesses and residents, offering protection from rival gangs or even from themselves. Gambling dens and illegal drinking establishments were also common sources of income for these gangs, offering temporary escape from the harsh realities of slum life, but only serving to perpetuate the cycle of poverty and addiction. Violence was commonplace in these territories. Street brawls, drunken fights, and gang warfare were almost nightly occurrences. Knives and blunt instruments were the weapons of choice, and injuries were often severe, with little access to proper medical care. The police, often understaffed and overwhelmed, struggled to maintain order in these chaotic environments, and their presence was often met with hostility and resistance. Remember that there was very little legal protection for these communities, and many didn't trust the police even if they were present. They were viewed as outsiders, enforcing the laws of a society that seemed to ignore their plight. Perhaps the most harrowing aspect of crime and violence in the Victorian slums was the prevalence of domestic abuse. Trapped in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, with little hope for escape, families often crumbled under the weight of poverty and despair. Alcoholism was rampant, fueled by the availability of cheap gin and beer, and often exacerbated existing tensions. Men, frustrated by their inability to provide for their families, would often turn to violence, lashing out at their wives and children. Women in particular were vulnerable. They often lacked the means to support themselves or escape abusive relationships. The concept of marital rape was non-existent in law, and societal attitudes often condoned or excused male violence. Even if a woman did manage to leave, where would she go? The workhouses were often seen as a fate worse than death, and finding alternative accommodation was virtually impossible without money or support. Children were also victims of domestic abuse, often subjected to physical and emotional trauma. Child labor exposed them to further exploitation and violence, both within the home and in the workplace. These experiences left deep scars, perpetuating a cycle of violence and abuse that spanned generations, and there simply wasn't anywhere for a child to go. If they were lucky, they would find another kind soul in the slum who would offer them a place to rest their head. But even that kindness came at a price. It's important to remember that while not everyone living in a Victorian slum was involved in crime or violence, the conditions were ripe for its proliferation. Poverty, overcrowding, lack of opportunity, and the absence of effective law enforcement all contributed to a climate of lawlessness and despair. The slums were, in many ways, a breeding ground for social unrest, and the violence that permeated them was a symptom of a deeper societal malaise. The stories of hardship and criminality often intertwine in ways that make it difficult to pass any judgment. It was simply a different world than the one we know today, a world where survival came at a terrible price. The workhouse. Just the very word conjures images of bleakness, doesn't it? It was meant to be a last resort, a safety net for those who had absolutely nowhere else to turn in Victorian England. But for the slum dwellers, it was so much more than that. It was a symbol of utter failure, a badge of shame, and a place steeped in fear. Imagine, for a moment, the desperation that would drive someone, a mother perhaps, clutching her starving children to the gates of the workhouse. It wasn't an easy decision. It meant surrendering all sense of independence, of family unity, of even basic human dignity. The principles behind the workhouse were, well, let's just say they were harsh. Born out of the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, the idea was to deter people from seeking assistance unless they were truly destitute. The conditions inside were deliberately made worse than those of the poorest working person outside. This was known as the principle of less eligibility. The goal wasn't to help people get back on their feet, but to make pauperism, as it was called, so unattractive that only the truly desperate would apply. Entering the workhouse was a traumatic experience. Families were immediately separated. Husbands were separated from wives, and children from their parents. This was done to prevent procreation amongst the poor and to discourage what was seen as familial dependency. Can you imagine the heartbreak? To arrive seeking refuge only to be torn apart from the very people you were trying to protect. The regime inside was strict and regimented. Inmates were subjected to a monotonous routine of hard labor, often breaking stones, picking oakum, untwisting old ropes, or working in the fields. The work was deliberately pointless and arduous, designed to break the spirit and discourage idleness. Think about the monotony of endlessly picking apart rope fibers, day after day, hands raw and bleeding. There was no reward, no sense of accomplishment, just the endless grind. Food was meager and deliberately bland. The diet typically consisted of watery gruel, bread, and perhaps some thin broth, barely enough to sustain life, let alone fuel hard labor. Meat was a rare luxury. The aim was to provide just enough sustenance to keep people alive and working, but not enough to make them comfortable. It was about survival, plain and simple. Clothing was another source of humiliation. Inmates were stripped of their own clothes and issued with coarse, ill-fitting uniforms. These uniforms were often deliberately designed to be unflattering and easily identifiable, marking them out as paupers and separating them from the rest of society. It was a constant reminder of their degraded status. The dormitories were overcrowded and unsanitary. Disease was rampant. Tuberculosis, typhus, and other infectious illnesses spread quickly through the close quarters. The lack of proper hygiene and medical care meant that the workhouse was often a death sentence, particularly for the elderly and the very young. Children in the workhouse faced a particularly bleak future. They were often given rudimentary education, but their primary purpose was to provide cheap labor. Many were later sent out to work in factories or as domestic servants, often facing exploitation and abuse. The workhouse, intended as a place of refuge, often perpetuated the cycle of poverty. Beyond the physical hardships, the psychological toll of workhouse life was immense. The loss of freedom, the constant surveillance, the harsh discipline, and the separation from loved ones all contributed to a sense of despair and hopelessness. The workhouse was a place where self-worth withered and dreams died. The stigma associated with entering the workhouse was profound. It was seen as a sign of personal failure, a mark of shame that could follow a person for the rest of their life. Families would go to extraordinary lengths to avoid the workhouse, even enduring extreme hardship and deprivation. The fear of the workhouse loomed large in the lives of the slum dwellers, a constant reminder of the precariousness of their existence. It's easy to look back now and condemn the Victorian workhouse system, but it's important to remember that it was a product of its time, born out of a complex set of beliefs about poverty, morality, and social responsibility. While the intentions may have been to alleviate poverty and discourage idleness, the reality was a system that often inflicted more harm than good. The workhouse stands as a stark reminder of the human cost of poverty and the importance of compassion and understanding in addressing the needs of the most vulnerable members of society. It highlights the dangers of policies that prioritize deterrence over genuine support and the long-lasting impact of stigma and shame. It's a chapter in history that is difficult to stomach, but one that is essential to understand, so that we might learn from the mistakes of the past and build a more just and equitable future for all. So sleep now, and let those grim images fade away, and resolve to be grateful for your warm bed, and remember the ones who were without it. Now, amidst all this hardship, a flickering light of hope began to emerge: philanthropy and charity. It might seem surprising, given the scale of the problem, but countless individuals and organizations dedicated themselves to alleviating the poverty and suffering that permeated the Victorian slums. It's easy to look back and criticize their efforts as insufficient, perhaps even misguided at times, but it's crucial to remember that they were operating in a world without the established welfare systems we have today. They were pioneers, grappling with problems of unprecedented scale and motivated by a genuine desire to help. So, who were these philanthropists, and what did they do? Well, the spectrum was incredibly broad. At one end, you had wealthy industrialists and aristocrats, often motivated by a sense of social responsibility, sometimes by religious conviction, and let's be honest, occasionally by a desire to improve their public image. They donated vast sums of money to establish hospitals, orphanages, and schools, all aimed at providing some degree of relief and opportunity for the slum dwellers. Names like George Peabody come to mind, an American banker who established the Peabody Trust, which built model dwellings for the working class in London, offering significantly improved housing at affordable rents. These model dwellings, though, were often a drop in the ocean, given the sheer number of people in need, and there were often criticisms about their design and management. Still, they represented a significant step in recognizing the need for better housing solutions. Then you had a plethora of charitable organizations, many of them religiously motivated. The Salvation Army, founded in 1865, became a familiar sight on the streets of London and other major cities. They provided food, shelter, and clothing to the destitute, and also offered spiritual guidance and support. Their approach was often quite direct, engaging with people on the streets, and they quickly became known for their brass bands and passionate evangelism. Other religious organizations, such as the Church Army, similarly focused on practical assistance and spiritual outreach, establishing missions and soup kitchens in the heart of the slums. Beyond the large-scale organizations, there were countless smaller charities and individual acts of kindness. Local churches often played a crucial role, providing assistance to their parishioners and offering food and clothing to those in need. Individual benefactors, often women from middle-class backgrounds, dedicated their lives to visiting the slums, offering comfort, advice, and practical help to families struggling to survive. These district visitors, as they were often called, would distribute food, blankets, and clothing, and also offer guidance on hygiene and childcare. Their work was often fraught with challenges, facing suspicion and resistance from some slum dwellers, and confronting the overwhelming scale of the problems they were trying to address. Now, it's important to acknowledge that these philanthropic efforts weren't without their limitations and criticisms. One common criticism was that they often focused on addressing the symptoms of poverty rather than the underlying causes. Giving food and clothing was certainly helpful in the short term, but it didn't address the structural inequalities that trapped people in poverty. Some critics argued that charity actually perpetuated the problem by creating a dependency on handouts and disincentivizing self-reliance. There was also a tendency, in some cases, to impose middle-class values and expectations on the slum dwellers without fully understanding their circumstances and cultural context. Furthermore, there was sometimes a moralistic tone to the charitable work, with a focus on rescuing the poor from their perceived vices, such as drinking and gambling.
This could be quite patronizing and judgmental, and it often failed to recognize the complex social and economic factors that contributed to these behaviors. However, it's worth remembering the social norms of the time, and that many philanthropists genuinely believed they were acting in the best interests of the poor, even if their methods were sometimes misguided. Despite these limitations, the philanthropic and charitable efforts of the Victorian era played a significant role in mitigating the worst effects of poverty in the slums. They provided a lifeline for many families struggling to survive, offering food, shelter, medical care, and education. They also helped to raise awareness of the plight of the poor and to create a sense of social responsibility among the more affluent members of society. Perhaps most importantly, they laid the groundwork for the development of more comprehensive and effective social welfare systems in the future. While charity couldn't solve the systematic issues involved in the existence of slums, for many it was the difference between life and death.
And it's worth reflecting on the individuals involved, the dedicated volunteers who braved the squalor and disease of the slums to offer a helping hand. These people, often unsung heroes, deserve our recognition and respect. They may not have been able to solve the problem of poverty entirely, but they made a tangible difference in the lives of countless individuals, and their compassion and dedication offer a powerful reminder of the enduring human capacity for kindness. So next time you see the logo of the Salvation Army, perhaps take a moment to reflect on the origins of that organization and the legacy of Victorian philanthropy that continues to shape our world today. Now, amidst the squalor and suffering that permeated the Victorian slums, a beacon of hope, however small, emerged in the form of religious missions. These weren't just churches with grand spires and stained glass windows. Although those existed too, these were often humble outposts, tucked away on grimy streets, run by individuals driven by a powerful sense of Christian duty. They aimed to tackle the immense social problems that seemed insurmountable to many. Think of it this way. Imagine the desperation, the feeling of being completely abandoned by society. Now, picture a small warm room, a friendly face, and the promise of a hot meal, some kind words, maybe even a little help finding work. That's often what these missions offered. These missions were spearheaded by a wide variety of denominations: Anglicans, Methodists, Baptists, Congregationalists, and even some Catholic orders, all recognizing the desperate need and feeling called to act. They weren't always working together, and their approaches could differ significantly, but their shared goal was to alleviate suffering and offer spiritual guidance to those who felt forgotten. The work they did was multifaceted, touching upon nearly every aspect of slum life. Obviously, there was the religious element, the core belief that converting people to Christianity or strengthening their existing faith would ultimately improve their lives. Services were held, often designed to be simple and accessible, using familiar language and hymns that resonated with the working class. Bible readings and prayer meetings were common. The aim wasn't to preach down to people, but to offer comfort and a sense of community in a world that often felt cold and isolating. But these missions understood that spiritual needs couldn't be addressed in a vacuum. You can't preach to someone on an empty stomach, or when they're riddled with disease and have nowhere to sleep. So practical assistance was a crucial part of their work. Food distribution was a frequent activity. Soup kitchens provided hot, nourishing meals to the hungry, often using donations of food from wealthier members of the community. Clothing depots collected and distributed second-hand clothes, offering some protection against the harsh weather. Many missions operated lodging houses, providing clean, safe, and affordable accommodation, a welcome alternative to the overcrowded and disease-ridden lodging houses run by unscrupulous individuals. Recognizing the importance of education, many missions also established schools, often called ragged schools because they welcomed children from all backgrounds regardless of their appearance or social status. These schools provided basic literacy and numeracy skills, along with religious instruction, giving these children a chance to escape the cycle of poverty, even if it was a small one. It offered an alternative to the factories or worse. The missions also played a role in healthcare, albeit a limited one. Some employed nurses who provided basic medical care and advice to families in their homes. They might dress wounds, administer simple remedies, and offer guidance on hygiene and sanitation, crucial in environments where disease was rampant. They also acted as advocates for the poor, trying to navigate the complex and often unsympathetic world of Victorian social services. And then there was the work of visiting families. Missionaries, often women, would venture into the heart of the slums, knocking on doors, offering a friendly ear, and assessing the needs of the families they encountered. These visits weren't always welcomed. Some residents were suspicious of outsiders, fearing that they were there to judge or to interfere. But many families appreciated the support and companionship, seeing the missionaries as a lifeline in a sea of despair. Now, it's important to acknowledge that these missions weren't without their critics. Some accused them of being paternalistic, of imposing their own values and beliefs on the poor. Others argued that they were simply band-aids on a much larger problem, failing to address the root causes of poverty. And it's true, they weren't a perfect solution. They couldn't eradicate poverty or solve all the problems of the slums. But for many, these missions provided a vital service, a source of hope and support in a desperate situation. They offered a sense of community, a helping hand, and a reminder that they weren't completely forgotten. They provided practical assistance, education, and healthcare, making a tangible difference in the lives of countless individuals and families. Think about it. In a world where the state offered little in the way of social support, these religious missions filled a critical gap. They were often the only institutions providing any kind of safety net for the poor and vulnerable. And while their primary motivation may have been religious, their impact was undeniable. They helped to alleviate suffering, promote education, and improve the lives of those living in the Victorian slums. Their legacy, while often overlooked, is an important part of the story of how Victorian society grappled with the immense challenges of poverty and inequality. A story of people trying to make a difference, one small act of kindness at a time, and that in itself is a story worth remembering. In the vast, intricate tapestry of Victorian society, amidst the grime and despair of the slums, flickered a fragile hope: education. It might seem a distant, almost impossible dream, offering a glimmer of light in the all-encompassing darkness. But even here, in the heart of poverty, there were those who dared to believe in the transformative power of learning. We've talked a lot about the despair and the difficult conditions, and it's easy to get lost in that. But remember, even in the deepest darkness, there are always people fighting for a better world. And in the Victorian slums, those people were often found in the ragged schools. Ragged schools, the very name paints a picture, doesn't it? Not grand halls of academia, but humble, often makeshift spaces, offering refuge and rudimentary education to the most destitute children. These weren't your typical Victorian classrooms, filled with neatly dressed pupils reciting Latin verses. No, these were places where children with torn clothes, matted hair, and empty stomachs came to learn the bare essentials: reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. Think of them as beacons of hope, scattered across the bleak landscape of the slums. They were founded and run by philanthropists, religious organizations, and dedicated individuals who believed that even the poorest child deserved a chance to escape the cycle of poverty. The conditions in these schools, unsurprisingly, mirrored the harsh realities of the slums themselves. Overcrowding was rampant. Imagine squeezing dozens, sometimes hundreds of children into small, poorly ventilated rooms. The air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and damp clothes. Resources were always stretched thin. Books were scarce, often tattered and well-worn. Slates and chalk were precious commodities. And yet, despite these challenges, the teachers persevered, driven by a profound sense of compassion and a belief in the potential of their students. Who were these teachers? They were a mixed bag, really. Some were trained educators, but many were volunteers, often from the middle or upper classes, moved by the plight of the poor. Others were simply individuals with a basic education and a desire to help. Their dedication was remarkable, especially considering the difficult circumstances and the often unruly behavior of the children.
Many of the children attending ragged schools had never known a structured environment. They came from homes where survival was the only priority, where education was seen as a luxury or even a hindrance. Some were orphans, forced to fend for themselves on the streets. Others were child laborers, toiling in factories or mines from dawn till dusk. Trying to instill discipline and a love of learning in these children was no easy task.
The curriculum was basic, focusing on the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. The goal wasn't to produce scholars or intellectuals, but to equip these children with the fundamental skills they needed to improve their lives. Reading would allow them to access information, to understand the world around them. Writing would enable them to communicate, to express their thoughts and feelings. And arithmetic would give them the tools to manage their finances, to avoid being cheated or exploited. Beyond the academic curriculum, ragged schools also provided practical training. Girls were taught sewing, knitting, and other domestic skills that would help them find employment as servants or seamstresses. Boys were taught carpentry, shoemaking, and other trades that would allow them to earn a living. And perhaps most importantly, ragged schools offered a safe haven, a place where children could escape the harsh realities of their lives. If only for a few hours each day, they provided food, clothing, and sometimes even medical care. They offered a sense of community, a feeling of belonging, and they instilled a sense of hope, a belief that a better future was possible. It's important to remember that ragged schools were not a perfect solution. They were often underfunded, understaffed, and unable to reach all the children who needed their help. And even those who did attend often faced significant challenges in overcoming the deeply ingrained poverty and social stigma that surrounded them. Despite their limitations, ragged schools played a vital role in providing education and support to the most vulnerable children in Victorian society. They were a testament to the power of compassion, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring belief in the transformative power of education. They represent a vital, albeit often overlooked, chapter in the story of Victorian social reform. They highlight the efforts of ordinary people to combat poverty and inequality, to provide hope and opportunity to those who had been left behind. Think about it. Even a small amount of literacy could make a huge difference. It could allow someone to read a warning sign, understand a contract, or simply write a letter to a loved one. It was about empowerment, about giving people the tools to navigate a complex world and to take control of their own lives. The impact of these schools wasn't just felt by the children themselves. It rippled outwards, affecting families, communities, and even the wider society. By providing education and support, ragged schools helped to break the cycle of poverty, to reduce crime, and to improve the overall health and well-being of the population. So, the next time you think about the Victorian era, don't just picture the grand palaces and the Industrial Revolution. Remember the ragged schools, those humble beacons of hope, shining brightly in the darkest corners of Victorian England. Remember the dedicated teachers, the resilient children, and the unwavering belief in the power of education to change lives. Because their story, too, is an essential part of the Victorian narrative. It's a story of compassion, of resilience, and of the enduring power of hope in the face of overwhelming adversity. And as we drift off to sleep tonight, that's a pretty good thing to keep in mind. Sanitation. It's a word that might not exactly set your pulse racing, but believe me, for those living in the Victorian slums, it was a matter of life and death. And like many things in Victorian England, progress was, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly a sprint, more of a slow, hesitant shuffle forward, often followed by a stumble backwards. You see, the prevailing attitude for a long time was largely laissez-faire, a fancy French term meaning let it be. The government and local authorities were often reluctant to interfere with private property rights or to spend what they saw as exorbitant amounts of public money on things like sewers and clean water. After all, wasn't it up to the individual to keep themselves clean? This attitude, fueled by a distrust of government intervention and a deep-seated belief in personal responsibility, unfortunately didn't account for the realities of slum life. The sheer density of the population made individual action almost impossible. Imagine trying to keep your own backyard spotless when your neighbor's overflowing cesspool is practically lapping at your doorstep. It just wasn't feasible. But thankfully, things did eventually start to change. Slowly, one major turning point came with repeated outbreaks of cholera. Cholera, as we've discussed, was a terrifying disease, spread through contaminated water, and the slums were practically breeding grounds for it. It wasn't just a few isolated cases, mind you. We're talking about epidemics that claimed thousands of lives. And cholera, unlike some other diseases, didn't discriminate. It wasn't just the poor who suffered. The wealthy, the middle class, even doctors and politicians were all vulnerable if the water supply was tainted. These epidemics served as a rather unpleasant wake-up call. When prominent members of society started falling ill, the urgency to do something, anything, intensified dramatically. And so we begin to see the glimmerings of real public health reform. One of the key figures in this movement was Edwin Chadwick. A lawyer by training, Chadwick became deeply involved in social reform and was appointed secretary to the Poor Law Commission. He was a tireless advocate for improving sanitation and linking poverty and disease. In 1842, he published his landmark report on the sanitary condition of the laboring population of Great Britain. This report was, to put it mildly, damning. It meticulously documented the appalling living conditions in the slums, highlighting the lack of clean water, the overflowing sewers, the mountains of refuse, and the devastating impact these conditions had on public health. It wasn't just a dry recitation of facts, though. Chadwick painted a vivid picture of squalor and suffering, forcing people to confront the brutal reality of slum life. And perhaps most importantly, he argued that investing in sanitation was not just morally right, but economically sound. He showed that disease led to lost productivity, increased poverty, and higher costs for things like poor relief. Chadwick's report was hugely influential, and it paved the way for the Public Health Act of 1848. Now, this act wasn't perfect by any means. It was a rather weak piece of legislation, relying heavily on local authorities to implement its provisions, and many local authorities were well reluctant to do so. After all, building sewers and water systems cost money, and many were more concerned with keeping taxes low than with improving the health of the poor. However, the 1848 Act did establish a central board of health, which had the power to intervene in areas where local authorities were failing to act. This was a crucial step forward, as it provided a central authority with the power to enforce at least some minimum standards. It was a start, albeit a small one. Over the following decades, further legislation was enacted, gradually strengthening the hand of public health officials. The Nuisances Removal Act, for example, gave local authorities the power to deal with things like overflowing cesspools and accumulations of refuse. The Artisans and Labourers Dwellings Improvement Act aimed to improve housing conditions, although its impact was limited. One of the biggest challenges was the provision of clean water. Many slum dwellers relied on polluted rivers and streams for their water supply, or on wells that were often contaminated by sewage. The construction of proper waterworks and reservoirs was a massive undertaking, but it was essential for improving public health. Gradually, cities began to invest in these projects, bringing clean water to more and more homes. Of course, this didn't happen overnight, and many of the poorest residents continued to rely on contaminated sources for years to come. Another crucial aspect of sanitation was waste disposal. Before the advent of modern sewage systems, human waste was often dumped in cesspools or simply thrown into the streets. This created a terrible stench and attracted rats and other vermin, spreading disease.
The development of underground sewers was a major step forward, but it was a slow and expensive process. Even when sewers were built, they often weren't properly maintained, leading to blockages and overflows. It's also important to remember that these reforms weren't just about building infrastructure. They also involved changing people's behavior. Public health officials had to educate people about the importance of hygiene and sanitation. They distributed pamphlets, gave lectures, and even went door to door, trying to convince people to adopt healthier habits. This wasn't always easy, as many people were resistant to change, or simply didn't have the resources to improve their living conditions.
And so, the story of public health reform in the Victorian slums is one of slow, incremental progress, punctuated by outbreaks of disease that forced society to confront the consequences of neglect. It was a battle fought on many fronts, in Parliament, in the streets, and in the homes of the poor. While the Victorians didn't solve all the problems, far from it, they did lay the foundations for the modern public health system that we have today, and that in itself is a remarkable achievement. Okay, let's settle in and take a look at how the government started to step in and try to fix some of the absolutely awful housing situations we've been discussing. It's easy to look back and judge, but remember, the idea of direct government intervention in housing was pretty radical back then. Laissez-faire economics, the idea that the government should just leave things alone, was still very much in vogue. So any intervention at all was a big deal. The first real crack in that laissez-faire approach came with what are broadly known as the Housing Acts. Now, there wasn't just one Housing Act. Oh no, it was a series of laws passed over several decades, each building on the last, and often frustratingly slow in their impact. Think of it like trying to steer a very large, very stubborn ship. You turn the wheel, but it takes a while for the ship to actually respond. That's kind of how these early housing acts were. One of the earliest significant pieces of legislation was the Labouring Classes Lodging Houses Act of 1851. Now, the name itself gives you a clue about its focus. It wasn't about solving all the housing problems for everyone. It was specifically aimed at providing better lodging houses for the working classes. It empowered local authorities to build and manage these lodging houses using public funds. Imagine that, public funds being used to provide housing. That was a pretty big step. These lodging houses weren't meant to be luxurious, of course. They were basic, functional, and most importantly, clean and sanitary. A far cry from the squalor of the slums. They offered single rooms, or sometimes shared rooms, for a small fee. This gave workers a much safer and healthier alternative to the overcrowded and disease-ridden private lodging houses. However, and there's always a however, the 1851 Act had limitations. It was permissive, not compulsory. This meant that local authorities could build these lodging houses, but they weren't required to, and sadly, many simply didn't bother. It cost money, it was seen as interfering with private enterprise, and well, the needs of the poor often came last. Next, we need to consider the Artisans and Labourers Dwellings Improvement Act of 1875, often called the Cross Act, after its sponsor Richard Cross. This was a more ambitious piece of legislation. The Cross Act recognised that simply providing lodging houses wasn't enough. You needed to tackle the slums themselves. This act allowed local authorities to identify areas with particularly bad housing, declare them unhealthy areas, and then purchase the land. They could then demolish the existing buildings and either build new housing themselves or sell the land to private developers who were required to build decent homes for the working classes. This was a much more radical approach, giving local authorities real teeth to actually do something about the slums. The idea was to replace the worst areas with proper housing, designed with sanitation and ventilation in mind. Now you might be thinking, great, problem solved. But again, the reality was much more complicated. Firstly, the process was incredibly slow and bureaucratic.
identifying an area, getting the necessary approvals, acquiring the land, demolishing the buildings. It all took years. And while all that was happening, people were still living in those awful conditions. Secondly, there was the issue of compensation. Local authorities had to pay landowners for the land they acquired, and often those landowners were savvy and managed to get inflated prices. This ate into the funds available for actually building new housing. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, there was the problem of displacement. When the slums were cleared, where did all the people who lived there go? Often they simply moved to other nearby slums, making those areas even more overcrowded. The Cross Act didn't really address this problem of rehousing adequately. It was a case of moving the problem, not solving it. Then came the Housing of the Working Classes Act of 1890. This consolidated and expanded on previous legislation, making it easier for local authorities to build and manage housing. It also introduced new powers, such as the ability to inspect and close down unfit dwellings. The 1890 Act was a significant step forward. It recognized that providing decent housing was a public responsibility and gave local authorities more tools to do the job. It also laid down standards for the construction of new housing, ensuring that it was built to a certain level of quality. However, even this act had its limitations. The pace of change was still slow, and many local authorities remained reluctant to use their powers. There was also a persistent problem with funding. Building and managing housing was expensive, and many local authorities simply didn't have the resources to do it effectively. It's important to remember the context here. These acts were passed in a time of enormous social upheaval, incredible population booms, and wildly uneven distribution of wealth. So while we look at the shortcomings, it's also important to recognize the significance of these first steps. Now, one of the unintended consequences of the Housing Acts was the rise of council housing. As local authorities became more involved in providing housing, they started to build their own estates. These estates, often located on the outskirts of cities, offered a much better quality of life than the slums. They had proper sanitation, running water, and gardens. For many working-class families, moving to a council house was a dream come true. It was a chance to escape the poverty and squalor of the slums and build a better life for themselves and their children. Of course, council housing wasn't perfect. There were problems with design, management, and social segregation, but it was a huge improvement on what had come before. So to sum up, the Housing Acts were a slow and gradual process of government intervention aimed at improving the terrible housing conditions in Victorian England. They weren't a magic bullet, and they had their limitations, but they were an important step in the right direction. They laid the foundation for the modern welfare state and the idea that everyone deserves access to decent, affordable housing. It's a legacy that continues to shape our society today. And while the problems of housing are still with us, we can look back at these early efforts and see that progress, however slow, is always possible. Welcome back, everyone. We've spent a considerable amount of time exploring the physical realities of the Victorian slums, the cramped quarters, the lack of sanitation, the constant threat of disease. But to truly understand the experience, we need to hear directly from those who lived it or those who ventured inside to document it. This section is dedicated to the voices of the slums. We'll be looking at first-hand accounts from residents, social investigators who bravely stepped into these areas to understand the conditions, and the journalists who brought these issues to the public's attention. These are the stories that paint a vivid and unforgettable picture of what life was really like. Let's begin with the residents themselves. Unfortunately, direct written accounts from the poorest slum dwellers are relatively rare. Literacy rates were low, and survival was often a more pressing concern than writing down one's experiences. However, through interviews, testimonies given to parliamentary committees, and records taken by social workers, we can glean glimpses into their daily lives. Imagine for a moment being a young mother in a London slum in the 1880s. You live in a single room with your husband and several children. The room is damp and the wallpaper is peeling. The air is thick with the smell of stale food, unwashed clothes, and the ever-present odor of sewage from the nearby overflowing drains.
You work long hours as a laundress, scrubbing clothes in a backyard filled with grime, just to make enough money to buy a few scraps of food. You worry constantly about your children's health, knowing that a simple cough could quickly turn into a deadly illness. You're exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but you keep going, driven by an unwavering love for your family and a fierce determination to survive. A recurring theme in the accounts we do have is the constant struggle for survival. Poverty was not just an inconvenience, it was a relentless, all-consuming force that shaped every aspect of life. Food was scarce and often of poor quality. Many families subsisted on a diet of bread, potatoes, and whatever else they could find or afford. Meat was a rare luxury. Disease was rampant, and medical care was largely inaccessible. Debt was a constant companion, and the threat of eviction loomed large. One woman, whose testimony was recorded by a social worker, described her family's situation like this: "We are that poor we are. We often go to bed hungry, and the children cry for food. My husband, he tries his best, but the work is scarce and the pay is low. We pawn our clothes to get a bit of bread, and then we have nothing to wear to church on Sunday. It's a hard life, ma'am, a very hard life." Now let's turn to the social investigators. These were individuals, often from middle or upper-class backgrounds, who dedicated themselves to studying and documenting the conditions in the slums. People like Charles Booth, whose monumental work, Life and Labour of the People in London, provided a comprehensive and detailed survey of poverty in the city. Booth and his team meticulously mapped London, color-coding streets according to the income levels of the residents. The resulting maps revealed the stark reality of poverty, with vast swathes of the city shaded in black and dark blue, indicating areas of extreme deprivation. Booth's approach was based on empirical research and statistical analysis, and he spent years interviewing residents, visiting workhouses, and collecting data on poverty, employment, and housing. His findings challenged the prevailing assumptions about the causes of poverty and highlighted the systemic nature of the problem. He believed that poverty was not simply a matter of individual failings, but was also a product of social and economic forces. Another notable figure was Beatrice Webb, a social reformer and economist who, along with her husband Sidney Webb, played a key role in the development of social policy in Britain. Beatrice Webb conducted extensive research on poverty and inequality, and her writings shed light on the plight of the working class. She emphasized the importance of government intervention to address social problems and advocated for policies such as minimum wage laws and social insurance. These investigators weren't simply detached observers. They often formed relationships with the people they studied, listening to their stories and advocating for their rights. They became voices for the voiceless, using their research and writings to raise awareness of the realities of slum life. Finally, let's consider the role of journalists. The Victorian era saw the rise of mass media, and newspapers and magazines played an increasingly important role in shaping public opinion. Some journalists took it upon themselves to expose the conditions in the slums, using vivid language and powerful imagery to bring the plight of the poor to the attention of a wider audience. One of the most influential examples is W. Stead, the editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, who in 1885 published a series of articles titled The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon. These articles exposed the widespread practice of child prostitution in London and caused a sensation. Stead's reporting sparked public outrage and led to significant reforms in child protection laws. While his methods were controversial, he effectively bought a young girl from her mother to demonstrate the ease with which children could be procured for prostitution. His exposé had a profound impact. Another journalist, George Sims, wrote a series of articles titled How the Poor Live for the Pictorial World in the 1880s. Sims described the squalor and overcrowding of the slums, the struggles of working-class families, and the prevalence of disease and crime. His articles were accompanied by illustrations that vividly depicted the scenes he described. He focused on individual stories, bringing a human face to the statistics of poverty and neglect. These journalists, like the social investigators, faced challenges and risks in their work. They often encountered resistance from landlords and local authorities, and they sometimes faced threats from those who sought to suppress their reporting. But they persevered, driven by a sense of moral obligation to expose the truth and to advocate for social change. The voices of the slums, whether they come directly from the residents themselves, from the social investigators who sought to understand their lives, or from the journalists who brought their stories to the public, provide invaluable insights into the realities of Victorian poverty. They remind us that behind the statistics and the historical accounts are real people with hopes, dreams, and struggles. And listening to these voices is essential if we are to truly understand the legacy of the Victorian slums and the lessons they hold for us today. Today, we're peering into a world that for many Victorians remained unseen, deliberately ignored, or simply unimaginable. We're talking about the photographic record of the slums. Think about it. Victorian England was a society obsessed with appearances. Portraits were meticulously posed, landscapes carefully curated to showcase the nation's prosperity and progress. But what about the grim realities hidden in the dark alleys and overcrowded tenements? How were those captured, and perhaps more importantly, why? Photography was still a relatively new technology in the mid-19th century, a process involving cumbersome equipment and lengthy exposure times. It wasn't exactly a point-and-shoot affair, and yet, despite these challenges, a number of pioneering photographers ventured into the heart of the slums, armed with their cameras and a desire to document the lives of the forgotten. One of the earliest and most influential figures was a Scottish photographer named Thomas Annan. In the 1860s and 70s, Annan was commissioned to document the old closes and streets of Glasgow, a network of medieval lanes slated for demolition due to their appalling living conditions. These weren't intended as social critiques, at least not overtly. The initial purpose was primarily archival, a way to record these disappearing spaces before they vanished forever, swept away by urban redevelopment. But what Annan's photographs inadvertently captured was far more powerful than a simple record of architecture. His images, often stark and unflinching, revealed the abject poverty and squalor in which countless Glaswegians lived. We see narrow, dimly lit alleyways, crumbling buildings, and the faces of the residents themselves, gaunt, weary, and often bearing the marks of hardship. The photographs speak volumes about the lack of sanitation, the overcrowding, and the sheer desperation of life in these neglected corners of the city. It's important to remember that these early photographs were often staged, to some extent. Exposure times were long, meaning people had to remain still for several seconds, sometimes even minutes. This meant a certain amount of posing was unavoidable, and it's possible that the scenes were sometimes manipulated to create a particular effect. But even with these limitations, the underlying reality shines through. The weariness in the eyes, the tattered clothing, the very environment itself, all bear witness to the harsh realities of slum life. Later in the Victorian era, figures like John Thomson began using photography more explicitly as a tool for social reform. Thomson, in collaboration with journalist Adolph Smith, published Street Life in London in 1877. This groundbreaking work combined Thomson's striking photographs with Smith's insightful text to create a powerful portrait of London's working class. Unlike Annan's more detached approach, Thomson and Smith actively sought to give a voice to the people they photographed. They interviewed street vendors, beggars, laborers, and other marginalized individuals, documenting their stories and struggles alongside their portraits. This combination of visual and textual information provided a much richer and more nuanced understanding of poverty in Victorian London.
Thompson's photographs are particularly compelling because of their focus on individual faces. We see the flower sellers, the chimney sweeps, the street musicians, each with their own unique story etched into their features. These images humanize the often abstract concept of poverty, reminding viewers that behind the statistics and the social problems, there were real people struggling to survive.
But it wasn't just professional photographers who were documenting the slums. Amateur photographers, social reformers, and even some slum residents themselves began using photography to shed light on these hidden worlds. These images, often less polished and more candid than the work of the professionals, offer a valuable glimpse into the everyday realities of slum life. Consider the work of Jacob Riis. Though technically he was active in New York City, his style and mission resonates heavily with the kind of work being carried out in Britain. Riis was a social reformer and journalist who used photography as a weapon against poverty. His book, How the Other Half Lives, published in 1890, shocked the American public with its graphic depictions of tenement life. Riis used flash photography, a relatively new technology at the time, to capture scenes of shocking squalor in the dead of night. His images, often grainy and unflattering, were deliberately intended to be jarring and confrontational, to shake people out of their complacency and demand action. While the circumstances were slightly different, the impact was the same. By exposing the terrible living conditions to a wider audience, the reformers hoped to inspire change. They hoped to push for better housing, sanitation, and working conditions for the poor. Now, of course, we have to acknowledge the ethical considerations surrounding this type of photography. The power dynamics at play were significant. Photographers, often from privileged backgrounds, were essentially documenting the lives of people who had very little power or agency. There's a risk of exploitation, of turning people's suffering into a spectacle for the amusement or edification of the middle and upper classes. Were the people being photographed aware of how their images would be used? Did they consent to being photographed? Did they benefit in any way from the exposure of their plight? These are important questions to consider when evaluating the photographic record of the slums. Despite these ethical complexities, the photographic legacy of the Victorian slums remains incredibly valuable. These images provide us with a powerful and immediate connection to the past, allowing us to see and understand the realities of slum life in a way that words alone simply cannot convey. They serve as a reminder of the social inequalities that existed in Victorian England and of the importance of fighting for a more just and equitable society, even today. They force us to confront the uncomfortable truths about our own past and to consider the human cost of industrialization, urbanization, and social neglect. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us that even in the darkest corners of society, there is always a human story to be told, a story that deserves to be heard and remembered. The photographs aren't just pictures, they're echoes of voices long since silenced, but still whispering to us across the years. All right, settle in, because now we're going to talk about how the Victorian slums found their way into literature, those wonderful books and poems that even today shape our understanding of the era. It's easy to forget, nestled as we are with our modern conveniences and perspectives, that the Victorians were also learning about these horrors, often for the first time, through the very same stories we read today. Before mass media as we know it, novels and poems were incredibly powerful tools for social commentary. They offered immersive glimpses into worlds that many, particularly the wealthier classes, would never otherwise encounter. Think of them as the documentaries of their day, albeit with a dash of artistic license. One of the most prominent voices shining a light on poverty was, of course, Charles Dickens. It's almost impossible to talk about Victorian literature and ignore the towering figure of Dickens. His novels like Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, and Bleak House are practically synonymous with Victorian London and its stark inequalities. In Oliver Twist, for instance, Dickens doesn't just tell a story, he takes us on a guided tour through the darkest corners of the city.
We see the squalor of the workhouses, the cunning of Fagin and his gang of child thieves, and the desperate struggle for survival on the streets. Dickens doesn't shy away from the grime and the misery. He forces his readers to confront it head-on and to empathize with the characters trapped within its grip. The book became a massive talking point and influenced popular opinions on poverty. And it wasn't just the grim realism that made Dickens so effective. He also had a knack for creating memorable characters, both villainous and virtuous, who embodied the different aspects of the slum experience. Fagin, the archetypal criminal mentor, is a terrifying yet strangely compelling figure. Oliver himself represents the innocence and vulnerability of children caught in poverty's web. Then there's A Christmas Carol. Now, while not exclusively about slums, it powerfully illustrates the consequences of indifference to poverty. Scrooge's transformation is a direct result of witnessing the suffering of the Cratchit family and the spectral visions of ignorance and want. It's a stark reminder that individual actions can have a profound impact on the lives of others, particularly those struggling in poverty. But Dickens wasn't the only one wielding the pen as a weapon against social injustice. Elizabeth Gaskell, another significant Victorian novelist, offered a more nuanced and often equally bleak portrayal of the industrial North in works like Mary Barton and North and South. In Mary Barton, Gaskell explores the lives of working-class families in Manchester, capturing their struggles with unemployment, poverty, and social unrest. She doesn't shy away from depicting the harsh realities of factory life, the desperation that leads to crime, and the devastating impact of industrialization on human lives. What sets Gaskell apart is her ability to portray her working-class characters with dignity and complexity. They aren't simply victims, they are individuals with their own hopes, dreams, and flaws. She humanizes them in a way that challenges the prevailing stereotypes of the time. Moving beyond novels, poetry also played a vital role in depicting the realities of slum life. Poets like Thomas Hood and Ebenezer Elliott used their verses to expose the suffering and exploitation that existed beneath the veneer of Victorian prosperity. Hood's The Song of the Shirt, published in 1843, is a particularly poignant example. It tells the story of a seamstress working tirelessly for meager wages, her life slowly being consumed by poverty and toil. The poem's simple yet powerful language and its focus on the plight of a single individual resonated deeply with readers and helped to raise awareness of the sweatshop conditions prevalent in Victorian London. Eliot, known as the Corn Law Rhymer, focused his poetry on the political and economic issues that contributed to poverty. His verses often attacked the Corn Laws, which kept the price of grain artificially high, making it difficult for working-class families to afford food. Now, it's important to acknowledge that these literary depictions weren't always entirely accurate or unbiased. Authors often brought their own perspectives and prejudices to their work, and their portrayals of the slums could sometimes be sensationalized or romanticized. Some critics argued that Dickens, for example, focused too much on individual morality and not enough on the systemic issues that perpetuated poverty. However, regardless of their potential biases, these novels and poems played a crucial role in shaping public perception of the slums. They brought the realities of poverty to the attention of a wider audience, sparking debate and prompting calls for social reform. They helped to create a sense of empathy and understanding for those living in the most marginalized communities, and they continue to serve as a powerful reminder of the social injustices that existed in Victorian England. They gave a voice, albeit a fictionalized one, to those who were so often voiceless. They challenged the comfortable assumptions of the middle and upper classes, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable truths about the society in which they lived. And perhaps most importantly, these works of literature helped to pave the way for the social reforms that would eventually improve the lives of the poor and marginalized in Victorian England. So, as you read these books, remember that they weren't just stories. They were weapons in a fight for social justice, and their impact can still be felt today. It's powerful to remember that even in darkness, art can illuminate.
The impact on mental health in the Victorian slums. It's hard to truly grasp the sheer unrelenting weight of it all, isn't it? Imagine waking up every single day to the same grim reality. The damp seeping into your bones, the gnawing hunger in your stomach, the constant fear of illness, of losing what little you have, of everything. Stress was, without a doubt, a constant companion. Not the kind of stress we might experience before a deadline or a big event, but a deep-seated chronic stress that eroded your very being. Think about it. How do you pay the rent this week? Where will the next meal come from? Will your children survive the winter? Will you? These weren't abstract worries. They were immediate, life or death questions. And with so many families crammed into single rooms, there was simply no escape, no privacy, no quiet corner to collect yourself. Just the ceaseless clamor of poverty, the cries of children, the coughs of the sick, the arguments fueled by desperation, that constant pressure, that unending anxiety. It took a terrible toll. And then there's the trauma. We often think of trauma as something inflicted by a single catastrophic event, but in the slums, trauma was woven into the very fabric of daily life. The death of a child, a tragically common occurrence, was a wound that never fully healed. Witnessing violence, whether it was domestic abuse fueled by desperation and alcohol, or street brawls born from frustration and anger, left scars that lingered long after the bruises faded. The constant threat of eviction, the humiliation of begging for scraps, the fear of being sent to the workhouse, these were all deeply traumatic experiences that shaped the lives of those who endured them. And let's not forget the children. Growing up in such conditions meant witnessing things no child should ever see. They were often forced to work long hours in dangerous conditions, exposed to physical and emotional abuse, and deprived of the basic necessities of life. This kind of early trauma could have devastating consequences, leading to lifelong problems with mental health, substance abuse, and difficulty forming healthy relationships. The weight of responsibility thrust upon their young shoulders was simply unbearable. Imagine being a child, responsible for bringing money home, knowing the very survival of your family hinges on your ability to work. It's heartbreaking. But perhaps one of the most insidious aspects of slum life was the profound sense of social isolation. Even though people were crammed together in unbelievably close quarters, a deep sense of loneliness pervaded. Shame, you see, was a powerful the shame of poverty, of being seen as less than, of not being able to provide for your family. This shame often led people to withdraw, to isolate themselves from their neighbors, even their own families. It was a vicious cycle. Poverty led to shame, shame led to isolation, and isolation only deepened the despair, and the lack of social support made things even worse. In the slums, there was often no one to turn to for help. Families were stretched to their breaking points, and charity, while well-intentioned, was often insufficient to meet the overwhelming need. People felt abandoned, forgotten, invisible. This sense of isolation could lead to feelings of hopelessness, despair, and even suicidal ideation. It's important to remember that mental health issues weren't talked about openly in Victorian England. There was a stigma surrounding mental illness, and people were often afraid to seek help. Even if it was available, many suffered in silence, their mental anguish compounded by the lack of understanding and support. Alcohol, of course, became a common coping mechanism. It offered a temporary escape from the harsh realities of slum life, a brief respite from the pain and despair. But alcohol abuse only exacerbated the problems, leading to violence, crime, and further degradation. It was a dangerous cycle, one that trapped many in a downward spiral of addiction and misery. We often read about the physical hardships of Victorian slum life, the disease, the hunger, the overcrowding. But it's crucial to remember the invisible wounds, the mental and emotional scars that were just as devastating.
The stress, the trauma, the social isolation, these were the hidden burdens that weighed heavily on the hearts and minds of those who lived in the shadows of Victorian society. And while we can never fully comprehend the depth of their suffering, it's important to acknowledge their pain, to remember their stories, and to learn from the mistakes of the past. Because even though the Victorian slums may be gone, the legacy of poverty and its impact on mental health remains with us today. And by understanding the past, we can work towards creating a more just and compassionate future for all. So perhaps tonight, as you drift off, you'll think of those who lived and died in the slums, and perhaps, just perhaps, it will inspire a little more kindness, a little more empathy in your own life. Okay, so we've seen just how brutal life was in the Victorian slums, but what were the long-term consequences? Did those who clawed their way out manage to break free completely, or did the muck of the slums cling to them and their families for generations? And what hope was there really of escaping such dire circumstances? The truth is, the Victorian slums perpetuated a vicious cycle of generational poverty. Imagine being born into a family already struggling with debt, poor health, and limited access to education. From the moment you arrive, you're fighting an uphill battle. Your parents, likely overworked and underpaid, may not have the time or resources to provide you with a nurturing environment or the opportunities you need to thrive. They might even be suffering from mental health issues brought on by the constant stress and trauma of slum life. Children growing up in these conditions often lacked proper nutrition, leading to stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and impaired cognitive development. This, of course, made it even harder for them to succeed in school, if they even attended school regularly. Remember, for many families, sending children to work was a necessity for survival. Every penny counted, and a child's nimble fingers and small stature were often exploited in factories, mines, and as street vendors. This robbed them of their childhoods and severely limited their future prospects. And let's not forget the constant exposure to disease. Living in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions meant that illnesses spread rapidly. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis. These were constant threats, and they often left survivors with long-term health problems that further hampered their ability to work and provide for their families. So what about social mobility? Could someone born in the slums actually climb the social ladder? Well, the answer is complicated. While it wasn't impossible, it was incredibly difficult. The odds were stacked against them from the very beginning. Think about it. Access to education was a major barrier. While ragged schools and other charitable organizations did their best to provide basic literacy and vocational training, these efforts were often inadequate to compete with the education received by children from wealthier families. Even if a child from the slums managed to excel academically, they might still face discrimination based on their social background. Then there's the issue of social networks. Who you know often matters just as much as what you know. Children from privileged backgrounds had access to networks of influential people who could help them secure jobs and advance their careers. Those from the slums lacked these connections, making it much harder for them to break into certain industries. Furthermore, the psychological impact of growing up in poverty could be devastating. The constant stress, trauma, and social isolation could lead to feelings of hopelessness, anxiety, and depression. These mental health issues could make it difficult for individuals to maintain stable employment, build healthy relationships, and make sound decisions. The weight of the slum, you see, often extended far beyond its physical boundaries. However, it's important not to paint too bleak a picture. Despite the immense challenges, some individuals did manage to escape the cycle of poverty. They often did so through a combination of hard work, determination, and sheer luck. Some found opportunities in the burgeoning industrial sector, working their way up from unskilled labor to skilled trades. Others pursued education or apprenticeships, acquiring the skills they needed to secure better-paying jobs. Still others relied on the support of family and community members who helped them navigate the challenges of slum life. These success stories, while inspiring, were the exception rather than the rule. For the vast majority of slum dwellers, the reality was one of persistent poverty and limited opportunities. The Victorian slums were a trap, and escaping that trap required not just individual effort, but also systemic change. It's also worth noting the societal attitudes at the time. There was often a prevailing belief that poverty was the result of personal failings, rather than structural inequalities. This view made it difficult to garner support for policies that would address the root causes of poverty and promote social mobility. The poor were often blamed for their own misfortune, further entrenching them in their disadvantaged position.
Consider too the role of luck. A chance encounter, a lucky break, or the generosity of a stranger could sometimes make all the difference. But relying on luck is hardly a sustainable strategy for escaping poverty. What these instances do highlight is the fundamental unfairness of the system and the arbitrary nature of opportunity. In the end, the long-term effects of living in the Victorian slums were profound and far-reaching. Generational poverty became deeply entrenched, limiting the opportunities of countless individuals and perpetuating cycles of inequality. While some managed to escape, their stories serve as a reminder of the immense obstacles that slum dwellers faced and the need for systemic change to address the root causes of poverty and promote social mobility. The struggle for a better life, for so many, began at a crippling disadvantage, and that reality cast a long shadow across generations. All right, settle in, because we're now drifting into a period of change, slow change, but change nonetheless. We've seen the grim reality, the sheer scale of human suffering packed into those Victorian slums. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, to think nothing could possibly be done, but even in the face of such monumental challenges, hope, however faint, flickered. This brings us to what we can call a gradual decline of these areas. Let's call it a slow reshaping. It wasn't a sudden demolition, a clean sweep, or a miracle cure. It was more like a persistent erosion, driven by a mix of motivations, some genuinely altruistic, others less so. The process, this reshaping, really took hold through what were called clearance projects. Now, the name sounds rather sanitized, doesn't it? Almost clinical. But behind that neutral term lay a complex and often messy reality. These clearance projects were essentially large-scale demolition and redevelopment schemes aimed at, clearing out the slums. The idea at its heart was to tear down the dilapidated housing, the overcrowded tenements, and replace them with something better. Ideally, something more sanitary, more spacious, and generally more livable. And in some cases, that's precisely what happened. New model dwellings were built, with improved sanitation, better ventilation, and even, dare I say, private water taps. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? The reality was often far more complicated. Firstly, the scale of the problem was simply enormous. These slums weren't small pockets of poverty. They were vast, sprawling labyrinths that housed hundreds of thousands of people. So even the most ambitious clearance projects could only tackle a tiny fraction of the problem. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, there was the question of who benefited from these projects. Often, the original inhabitants of the slums weren't the ones who ended up living in the new housing. The new dwellings, even the model ones, often came with higher rents. This effectively priced out the very people they were supposedly intended to help. They simply couldn't afford it. Where did they go then? They often ended up squeezed into other, already overcrowded areas, simply shifting the problem rather than solving it. It was like squeezing an overfilled balloon. Now, we need to consider the motivations behind these clearance projects. There were, undoubtedly, reformers and philanthropists who were genuinely motivated by a desire to improve the lives of the poor. They saw the slums as a moral stain on society and believed that providing better housing was a crucial step towards alleviating poverty and disease. However, there were other less noble motives at play too. Landowners and developers, for example, often saw slum clearance as an opportunity to acquire valuable land for redevelopment. They could demolish the existing housing, build new commercial properties, or more expensive residential buildings, and, profit handsomely.
Sometimes this was at the expense of community and social connection. And let's not forget the issue of public health. The constant outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and other diseases in the slums posed a threat not only to the slum dwellers themselves but also to the wealthier parts of the city. So clearing out the slums was also seen as a way to protect the health of the entire population, or so they said. The process itself was often disruptive and traumatic for the slum dwellers. Families were uprooted from their homes, communities were scattered, and people were forced to find new places to live, often with little or no assistance. There was often a profound sense of loss and displacement. The only homes they had ever known, simply gone. Beyond the large-scale clearance projects, there were also smaller, more incremental changes taking place. The passing of public health legislation, for example, led to improvements in sanitation and water supply in some areas. New building regulations were introduced to ensure that new housing met certain minimum standards, but these changes were often slow to take effect, and enforcement was often patchy. And of course, there were the efforts of charities and religious organizations to provide assistance to the poor. These organizations often ran soup kitchens, provided medical care, and offered education and training. While their efforts were often limited in scope, they provided a lifeline for many who were struggling to survive. So the decline of the Victorian slums was a complex and multifaceted process. It wasn't a sudden event, but rather a gradual erosion, driven by a mix of motivations and resulting in a mix of outcomes. Some people benefited, while others were left worse off. The slums didn't disappear overnight, but they did slowly begin to change, to be reshaped, and in some small ways become more bearable places to live, although it was far from a perfect solution. A slow, imperfect, but still a change, a shift towards something better. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through the dark, cramped alleys and overcrowded tenements of the Victorian slums. It's been a somber exploration, hasn't it? A peek into a world of hardship, resilience, and a desperate struggle for survival. But before we close the book on this chapter of history, it's vital to reflect on the legacy of the Victorian slums and, perhaps more importantly, the lessons they offer us today. The physical scars of the Victorian slums may have largely faded from the urban landscape. Clearance projects, urban renewal, and the relentless march of progress have swept away many of the physical reminders. Yet, the legacy of those dark days runs far deeper than bricks and mortar. It's woven into the very fabric of our society, subtly influencing our understanding of poverty, inequality, and the responsibilities we have to one another. One of the most enduring legacies is the heightened awareness of social responsibility. The Victorian era, for all its inequalities, also witnessed the rise of powerful social movements, driven by a growing sense of moral obligation. Figures like Octavia Hill, who pioneered social housing management, and reformers who tirelessly campaigned for better sanitation and working conditions, laid the groundwork for the welfare state systems we know today. Their efforts, born from witnessing the appalling conditions in the slums, remind us that societal progress often stems from confronting uncomfortable truths and demanding change. It's a quiet but powerful echo that still reverberates today. The Victorian slums also serve as a stark reminder of the interconnectedness of public health and social well-being. The outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis that ravaged these communities weren't simply isolated incidents of disease. They were direct consequences of overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate access to clean water. The lessons learned about the importance of public health infrastructure, preventative medicine, and access to health care for all remain profoundly relevant in the 21st century. We only need to look at contemporary challenges like managing pandemics or addressing health disparities to see the enduring wisdom gleaned from the bitter experiences of the Victorian era. And let's not forget the crucial lesson regarding the cyclical nature of poverty. The The Victorian slums weren't just a temporary blip in history, they were a breeding ground for generational poverty, where children born into deprivation were often trapped in a cycle of low wages, poor education, and limited opportunities. Breaking these cycles requires sustained, multifaceted interventions, addressing not just immediate needs but also the underlying structural inequalities that perpetuate poverty. This includes investing in education, providing access to affordable housing, creating job training programs, and ensuring fair wages. These are all hard lessons learned from the past. Furthermore, the legacy of the Victorian slums compels us to confront the ethical dimensions of economic development. The rapid industrialization that fueled the growth of Victorian cities created immense wealth, but it also came at a tremendous human cost. The exploitation of child labor, the appalling working conditions in factories, and the vast disparity between the rich and the poor highlight the dangers of prioritizing economic growth at the expense of social justice. It forces us to ask, what kind of society do we want to build? What values should guide our economic policies? And how can we ensure that the benefits of progress are shared more equitably?
The artistic and literary representations of the Victorian slums also continue to shape our understanding of poverty and social injustice. The novels of Charles Dickens, the photography of Jacob Riis, and the social investigations of Henry Mayhew provided a powerful and unflinching portrayal of slum life, raising awareness and inspiring action. These works remind us of the power of art to bear witness to suffering, to challenge injustice, and to ignite empathy. They encourage us to engage with the stories of marginalized communities, to listen to their voices and to amplify their experiences. The stories, the photographs, the novels, they whispered a question then and whisper one now. Are we doing enough? Now, as we look around the world today, we see echoes of the Victorian slums in the informal settlements and marginalized communities that exist in many cities. Overcrowding, lack of sanitation, inadequate access to healthcare, and persistent poverty remain pressing challenges for billions of people. The lessons of the Victorian era urge us to address these issues with urgency and compassion, recognizing that investing in the well-being of all members of society is not just a matter of charity, but a matter of justice and enlightened self-interest. Perhaps one of the most potent and often overlooked legacies is the incredible human resilience displayed by the residents of the Victorian slums. Despite facing unimaginable hardship, they formed strong communities, supported one another, and found moments of joy and connection amidst the squalor. Their resilience serves as a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure, to adapt, and to find hope even in the darkest of times. It reminds us that even in the face of adversity, human dignity and community can flourish, and that even now, there is always a chance for growth. Finally, the legacy of the Victorian slums reminds us that progress is not inevitable. It requires constant vigilance, sustained effort, and a commitment to social justice. We must learn from the mistakes of the past, challenge complacency, and strive to create a more equitable and compassionate world for all. The story of the Victorian slums is a cautionary tale, but it is also a story of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit. And so we hope, we learn, and we move forward, slowly, gently, and always with the lessons of the past held gently in our hearts. Good night.